this sense of being the guy or that guy this time, because I always look at the people who fly in right before they're supposed to speak and all of that, and I feel awful about it, and I hope all of the people who are the guys that do that feel awful too, because the point of a 140 conference is the interaction. And so it means that I've missed everybody that spoke up to this. However, sometime last night, flying into Fort Wayne, a bird gave up its life by flying into the engine. And so they had to inspect it this morning because they missed it on the walk around last night. And so that's part of why I'm late. Most people have a picture of what a chaplain is, from hospital chaplains, from military chaplains, from the 9/11 stuff that we've just been watching recently. The first person that was issued a death certificate was a fire department chaplain. For people from my generation who grew up watching MASH on television, the chaplain is Father Mulcahy. What Father Mulcahy did is tried to work around the edges of a medical unit doing the help that he could. He knew a little bit about helping by hauling blood out and that kind of stuff. He knew a little more about caring for people's lives. And so that's what he did. His authority in the MASH unit didn't come much from the Pentagon, didn't come much from the Vatican. It came way more from the relationships that he established and the availability that he had. He was there. It meant that people could find him and talk with him. Back in 2005, when this stuff called social media, the kind of media that fosters interaction as opposed to fostering broadcast stuff. When social media started, I started paying attention to it a little bit. In my early interactions, I almost never said that I was a pastor. There's a chilling effect that comes in conversations when you say that. And so I didn't tell anybody. I have a feeling that most people figured it out anyway. My blog at that point was levite.wordpress.com, and it's really, there's got to be something spiritual about Levite. So I was blogging, I was on Twitter, I finally got around to doing Facebook, and a bunch of the other services that have disappeared since then. And in 2006, I think, I started working with Becky. She was doing a podcast called The Great Big Small Business Show, and so I became the entrepreneurial chicken because I knew nothing about entrepreneurship and had no desire to do that, but I knew something about being a consumer, so I started contributing there. And the other thing that I started doing is figuring out how to write about God in as unchurchy a way as I possibly could. There seemed to be a significant number of people for whom church language is an issue, including myself, and so I worked that way. My title is executive pastor. I'm a number 2 person in a church. I don't do my writing as part of what I do for work. So I'm representing myself and God, I suppose, as opposed to my church. And one of the other things that happened about that time is Nancy and I started meeting people face to face. We met a guy named Chris Brogan at that time. He came to town. And I was in 2007 doing job interviews for a couple of pastoral positions. And so I gave the people that were interviewing me the names of social media friends. One of them was Chris, and one of them was a guy named Rob Hatch, who I had never met face to face. And the guy that they called was Rob Hatch, and they, okay, tell us about John. I don't know, I've never met him. But I figured that if I could talk in ways that made sense and were clear and accessible to people that I had never met face to face, that probably ought to be part of what's useful in being a pastor. I didn't get the first job, and I don't think it was Rob's fault, but I did get the second one. In 2009, I started writing a blog called 300wordsaday.com, which was 300 words about following Jesus. And at SobCon that year, a social media event, I realized that what I am is a social media chaplain. That what I do is I live in part of my life in the social media world, and like Father Mulcahy, I don't do it great, but I do a little bit more about knowing about souls. And so in that context, I can have conversations with people. And the reason that I do it is because my passion is to help people emotionally understand the truth of God's work. Help people emotionally understand the truth of God's work. So here's what that looks like. Some of you are bosses. Some of you are parents. Some of you are spouses or coworkers. Many of you, when you came here today, or you came yesterday, left a list of instructions. You said, here's what I'd like you to work on while I'm gone. You said, don't forget to study, like we've talked about studying. You said, when a difficult customer comes in, here's what to do. You remember how I worked with Mrs. Smith? This is how to do that. You said, you know, you may have trouble with the constable. He's been giving me a hard time too. Don't get into an argument. I'll take care of it when I get home. And you said, and remember, text me anytime. I'll get the message. It may take a while, but I'll reply. Does that sound familiar? Did anybody leave those kinds of messages? That's exactly what Jesus did when he left. His last instructions were, teach them how to obey what I've said, just like I've done for you. Now, truth is, lots of times in church we focus on the telling people what he said or beating people up with what Jesus said. But what he actually said was teach people how to obey. It's a much harder thing. It's the difference between saying, here's what you do, and saying, here, let me show you how to do that. So that's what I do, is I try and help people understand emotionally. We get the cognitive part, but it's that emotional part that's hard. Now, I confess, I wonder about numbers. I check. Sometimes I try things that I read will help build numbers, and it almost never works. Because numbers aren't people, and I care way more about people and relationships than I do about numbers. And when I start looking at the numbers, the people disappear. And it almost always takes me to broadcasting rather than social media. So me and Father Mulcahy were chaplains. Because our locations, whether it's in a tent in Korea like my dad went through when he was wounded in Korea, or a little church up in Grabill, Indiana, our locations let people with questions at moments of pain walk by. And there are lots of people that have lots of questions. So regardless of where home is, our parish is a tent. It's in Korea, it's in Grabill, or it's here. Now, this is the second time for one of your conferences that I've been speaking as a pastor and I've gotten done early. On Sunday morning I preached. I don't always preach at our church. A couple of times a year I mostly do teaching. So I am preaching in the older people service. We get to the end. I'm an inductive person, so I tell the story, and my headline is always at the end rather than at the beginning. And at 10 o'clock, as I'm giving the headline, those last two sentences, somebody's phone or alarm goes off with a rooster crowing 3 times, and I realized I should have been preaching about Peter. Thanks.